We're going to start a little bit differently today, and if you're a guest, I promise I do not do this every week, and this is going to be by volunteer only, but I have 2 crisp $10 bills here, and they are for 2 different people, and I'm going to ask by show of hands who would be willing to volunteer to say on microphone. Kara is ready. She's ready to go. You're going to be the first one. Here we go. Who wants to say their favorite Bible verse from memory and reference? Any willing volunteers, ladies and gentlemen? Come on. Somebody's got to be willing. Salem Poe. Salem Poe. Here we go.
Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord.
Hold on. We got to get everybody to be able to hear this. Here we go. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, she said,
Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your pathway straight.
Let's give her a big round of applause. It's not fair. She's a pastor's kid, right? We all know that. Well done. Well done, Salem. Who else wants to volunteer? Kara wants to volunteer. Here we go, ladies and gentlemen. Miss Kara Wells, fresh back from student camp. What do you got?
Philippians 4:13. For I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me.
Amen. Let's give her a round of applause. I should have given the caveat that you're not allowed to say John 11:35, Jesus wept. That's not fair. It's the shortest verse in the entire Bible. Well, the reason I do that as an illustration is I would imagine we could go around this room and have everybody quote their favorite Bible verse, and I would suspect that none of us would quote the passage that we are going to look at today. And that is because the passage we are going to look at today is the passage speaking about loving your enemies. None of us like to love our enemies, but the reality is that is what Jesus calls us to do. And so if you have a Bible, turn to Matthew chapter 5. And while you're turning there, I want to share with you a little quote that I saw this past week. In 2021, CBS News did a study, and they found that most Americans, 54%, now think that their biggest threat to their way of life comes from domestic enemies, meaning that Americans, fellow Americans, that we believe are against us or opposing our way of life. So the reality is we all have enemies, don't we? That we have people that we feel like, a matter of fact, you're probably thinking about that person in your mind right now. Maybe it's your boss. Don't elbow your spouse if you're sitting next to your spouse, right? So we all have people in our life that oppose us. And another study I found from the Pew Research Center said about 3 in 4 Americans, 79%, think that their fellow citizens have little confidence in each other. So what does that mean? It means that we today feel like we can't trust each other. And because of the fact that we feel like people are out to get us. And I think one of the biggest areas in life that creates enemies is something that is incredibly relevant this year, and that is the old political scene, right? That creates division, it's divisive, and I found a study and a stat. I want to make sure that you know that I did not create this stat. I am just telling you what people on the internet said. But the Pew Research Center said that among Democrats, 63% see Republicans as immoral, and for Republicans, 72% see Democrats as immoral. Now, you could argue, you could replace that word immoral with maybe an enemy, right? That we all have enemies in life, and at the onset of this message, I want to remind all of us that I think that's what the enemy wants us to think. He wants us to be at war with each other. He wants us to be opposed to each other. But I came to remind all of us today that our battle is not against flesh and blood. Ephesians 6:12 says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces in the heavenly realms." Our battle is not against people, friends. Even though we may dislike somebody and we may not be able to stand that they're a Rangers fan, and how on earth could they cheer for the Rangers when the Astros are now in first place, right? It's not going to last long probably, but it's all right. It's baseball. We may have people that are against us, but even though we have people we don't like, our battle is against the enemy. But that's the bad news. You know what the good news is? Some 2,000 years ago, Jesus went to the cross, and he defeated the enemy once and for all, not by just dying for our sins, but by rising again on the third day, so that even though we face battles in this life, church, we are in a battle that Jesus has already won. He has already won on our behalf, and we have to remember that. And so as we encounter people that just we don't get along with, that's just a part of life. And so even though we know that the enemy is behind a lot of this, I think we need to be careful to not assume that there's a demon under every bush. I think we all know that person maybe that automatically assumes Satan is in everything. Any of y'all ever seen Saturday Night Live back in the day? I've never seen it because I only watch Christian shows, but some of y'all I know probably have watched. I'm joking. So back in the day, there was this skit by Dana Carvey, the church lady. Do you remember this? Could it be Satan, right? That's sometimes what we assume when somebody is coming against us, or perhaps we perceive a human enemy. And the reality is sometimes the enemy is behind it, but sometimes it's just people that we're fallen and we're broken. And so even though Satan is at work and wants to use other people to distract us and divide us, he may not always be the person that's driving that force. But what we have to know is that we are going to face people in this life that we feel like are enemies. So here's what I want to start with at the onset of this message. Having enemies is unavoidable, but what we're going to see today is that acting godly towards them is possible. How do we know that? Because you and I were once enemies of God. You remember that? Romans 5:10 says, "For if, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life?" So if God loved us while we were enemies, what does that mean? Before we came to know Christ, before we stepped from death to life, we were enemies of God. The Bible doesn't just say that we were like out there. No, it says we were enemies of God. And yet God loved us so much that he still sent his son to die for us. And so if God did that for us, then we should be able to do the same for others. So the question then I wrestled with this week is how? Because this sounds good in theory, but it's a lot more difficult when we're talking about real life, isn't it? Well, today, Jesus is going to show us that as we continue this series called Summer on the Mount, and we're looking at Matthew chapter 5, and really we've been looking at that all summer, and I want to give a little bit of context for anybody that's brand new today. If you're here for the first time, the Sermon on the Mount is, in my opinion, the greatest sermon ever preached, and Jesus gathered his disciples on what we now call the Mount of Beatitudes. It's on the northeast side of Israel, and it was on the northwest side of the Sea of Galilee. By this point in Jesus' ministry, he started to have a bit of a crowd that followed around him. And Jesus originally was planning to take just his disciples up the mountain, but we believe from context that a significant portion of that crowd followed after him. And so he's really speaking to his disciples in this sermon, assuming that others are listening. And throughout this sermon, he takes a lot of the common teachings of that day and he's going to flip them upside down. And I want to use this passage to give 3 observations or 3 insights on how to love your enemies. Before we do, we always have a main point for today. If you have a listener guide, do me a favor and hold it in the air and jot this down. If you're a note taker, if you're not, that's cool. You can use it as a paper airplane to keep your neighbor awake. So if we want to live like Jesus, we must, y'all say must, love our enemies. So it's not an option Jesus is going to show us. It is a must for us to do. And the only way it is possible to love our enemies is by Jesus' power working in us and through us. That if we are dependent on our own strength, I know I cannot do it, you cannot do it, but through Jesus' help, we can actually love our enemies well. And he's going to show us 3 ways we do that. The first way, if we want to love our enemies, we need to be people that don't seek revenge. Y'all say revenge. So look at verse 38 through 42. Jesus says, "You have heard the law that says the punishment must match the injury. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. If you're sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give your coat too. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it 2 miles. Give to those who ask, and don't turn away from those who want to borrow. So I don't know about you, but I find one of the greatest temptations in life is to want to get even with somebody when they wrong us, right? And Jesus is speaking to the heart of this issue. He's saying that we, if we want to love our enemies, should not be people that seek revenge. Now, he uses one of his primary tactics in the Sermon on the Mount where he says, "You have heard it said, but I say unto you." And he takes what would have been known as a very common teaching and he flips it upside down, or rather takes it a whole step further. And in this first part, he uses this whole phrase, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That is what is often known as the law of reciprocal justice. Y'all say reciprocal? Y'all say justice. So another way of describing it would be the law of retaliation. And this would have been put in place centuries before Jesus showed up on the scene. And it was originally instituted to help combat or work against a punishment far exceeding a crime. So oftentimes what would happen is a crime would be committed, and the temptation in order to teach that person a lesson would to be have the punishment way exceed the crime. And so Jesus knew this, and he took this principle, and he's really kind of speaking into it. And so he says that you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I'm telling you that if someone slaps you on the cheek, you should give them the other cheek also. So he's taking it a whole step further. And the reason why is by the time Jesus shows up is that law that was put in place to help combat punishment not exceeding a crime was actually starting to be used to justify personal revenge against somebody, basically. And so Jesus knew this, and he's saying, no, this is not what it's all about. I'm showing you a better way. Now, this principle, I would argue, in many ways, is the converse of what John preached on, which, by the way, didn't John do an awesome job a couple weeks ago, July 4th, for those who were here? He did an awesome, we can clap for John. Great job. And he preached on the golden rule, which is found from Matthew 7:12, which says, do to others whatever you would like them to do to you. This is the essence of all that is taught in the law and prophets. So this whole eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth is kind of the opposite. Do you see how those two things are kind of the opposite of each other? And Jesus knew this, and he knew that the audience that he was talking to would be familiar with these teachings. And he proceeds to take it a step further. He's saying, no, you should not do that. You should not seek revenge. As a matter of fact, you should take it a whole nother level. What is Jesus teaching us here? He's saying we should be kind to others, even when they're not kind to us. It's difficult, but it's what he's calling us to do. I love this quote that I saw a couple weeks ago. It says, the best revenge is to have enough self-worth not to seek it. It's challenging, but Jesus is calling us to a higher way. And he's showing us this truth that oftentimes when we seek revenge against somebody, really there's a deeper issue going on, and that is that we are harboring another word that starts with R. People who seek revenge on their enemies, Jesus shows, are people who are carrying around resentment. Resentment, right? It's bitterness, it's frustration, it's anger. And St. Augustine, I've heard several people quote this, but I tend to attribute it to St. Augustine. Resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. It's true, isn't it? That many times we want to just get even with that person, and Jesus says, no, don't get even. I'm calling you to a higher way. I was trying to think of an illustration for this, and I was reminded of the profound theological movie, The Mighty Ducks. Anybody seen The Mighty Ducks? Yes, if you're born in the 80s, but the 90s raised you like me, the Mighty Ducks made you. I literally attempted to play ice hockey for 2 years because of this movie. It was a very short-lived failed experiment, but If you've not seen the Mighty Ducks, so a quick catch up on the scene is that Gordon Bombay, who's played by Emilio Estevez, is an attorney. He was a former hockey player. He gets sentenced in court. He gets a DUI, and his punishment is he has to coach this ragtag group of hockey players, and they were not very good. He takes them, and they win the championship in the first movie. By the second movie, they take that original group and then combine them with other players from around the country, and they become the USA Ducks. And so in this movie that we're about to watch, the short clip, they're about to play their arch rival, Iceland. And they're coached by Wolf the Dennis Stanson, who's also a former hockey player that was kicked out of the NHL for punching somebody. Gordon Bombay's a former player. The USA Ducks are having their final practice before Iceland, and somehow this one-on-one match between Gordon Bombay, a former hockey player, and Wolf the Dennis Stanson is about to break out. One important thing to note, that Gordon Bombay had a knee injury at one point, and so with that context, check out this clip.
One more post, you go home crying. By the way, Stanson, you owe me a beach ball.
Get your coach off the ice. We have to practice now.
So you see, he could have sought revenge. He could have sought to fight back. As a matter of fact, he was holding back the Bash brothers, Fulton Reed and Dean Portman, from trying to fight the other coach. And yet he could have easily pursued revenge, yet he chose not to. And I know that's not necessarily a super profound example, but it's a very clear picture of what this practice looks like. And I would say for somebody that, as far as we know, Gordon Bombay, at least in the movie, was not a Jesus follower. And if someone who's not a Jesus follower did not seek revenge, how much more so should we as Christians be people that live out this practice? Do we seek revenge when we're wronged, or do we turn the other cheek like Jesus says? So the first thing we need to do is not seek revenge. The second thing is we need to remember that our enemy is also our neighbor. Our enemy is also our neighbor. Verse 43 and 44, Jesus says, "You have heard the law that says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." So Jesus continues this tactic, if you will, where he says, "You have heard it said, but I say unto you." And he uses this phrase, love your neighbor, which would have been a very common known teaching in that day. As John talked about several weeks ago, the concept of loving your neighbor is found in almost every major religion. And the second Jesus said this, the people that would have been listening to Jesus would have immediately thought of Leviticus 19:18, which says, "Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against a fellow Israelite, but love your neighbor," y'all say neighbor, "as yourself, I am the Lord." So loving your neighbor is not a new teaching, but here's where Jesus takes it a step further. He says to love your enemies. Why is that significant? Well, I'm reminded of this passage in Luke chapter 10 that we have to remember that our enemy is also our neighbor. And in Luke chapter 10, Jesus is talking to some religious leaders, and they try to trap him. They say, "Hey, Jesus, how do we inherit eternal life?" And Jesus proceeds to say, "Well, what does the law of Moses say?" And they say, "Well, it says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus says, "Yes, go and do that, and you will live." Well, then the religious leader tried to double down a little bit further, and he says, "Well, hold on, Jesus, time out. Like, who exactly is my neighbor? Can you give me a better definition of that?" This is what, verse 29, the man wanted to justify his actions. "Then who is my neighbor?" And Jesus proceeds to tell this parable that we now know as the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, why is this important? Well, Samaritans were hated by the Jews. This is far deeper than Texas now going back in the SEC and Texas and A&M playing each other again, ladies and gentlemen. This is not that kind of hatred. I hear Aggies hissing over here in this section somewhere, right? This is far deeper than that. This is like, the best way I could describe it is what we're seeing now between Israel and Palestine. I mean, this is a deep level of hatred, and Jesus proceeds to tell this parable where a Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he was beaten by robbers and left for dead, and a Jewish priest walks by, and it says he could not be bothered. And then it says a Levite did the same thing, and then yet a Samaritan, and undoubtedly when Jesus told that story, I would imagine that the entire crowd would have gone, like just shocked that a Samaritan would be mentioned in this story. And it says the Samaritan stooped down and took care of this Jewish man, took him to an inn and said, I want you to take care of him, and anything I owe you, I will repay on my return. Why is that so important? That Jesus is showing us from Luke 10 and also from this passage that our enemy is also our neighbor. Now, why is that important? Why is that so difficult? And he says to pray for those people who persecute you. If you get nothing else today, I want us to get this. It is really hard to pray for someone and hate them at the same time. It's really difficult to genuinely pray for somebody, that person that you're thinking of that drives you crazy. It's really difficult to pray for them and also hate them at the same time. It's a difficult thing to do. And here's what I've also found. Our greatest enemy might be our greatest opportunity for ministry. That person in our life, Jesus may be calling us to love and care for, yet it's difficult to do. And what you can find is that you'll have two people, but it's all a matter of just one small change. You can have the two same people in the same situation, but one small change happens and the power of our perspective shifts. I'll give you an example of how you can have two people and one small change and it changes everything. In VBS a couple weeks ago, I walked into the prayer room and I found these letters on the table here. Joel is greater than Russell is what I saw spelled out. Worship pastors, right, apparently have nothing else to do with their time during VBS. And so I said, okay, that's fine. I get it, but I'm going to make one small change here. And so I proceeded to change one little thing around. Next picture. Joel is less than Russell, right? Same people, same situation. One small change changes the entire nature of that relationship. Well, the same thing is true of our perspective, isn't it? That how we view people can just as easily be changed. I'll give you another example. How many of y'all have a double-sided picture frame in your house somewhere, right? You can have the same person. I took a couple of pictures here. You see, many of us look at people through this lens of they are my nemesis. They are my enemy. I can't stand them. They're out to get me. And what Jesus is saying is through his help, we can flip our perspective. Same picture frame. Same person we're looking at, but it's all about our perspective. Much of life is not so much our predicament, it's all about our perspective. So my encouragement for you today is flip the frame. Flip the frame. Ask God to help you to flip the frame on who you're looking at. You see, when we realize that our nemesis is also our neighbor, it changes the way that we view them. And when we change the way that we view them, what should happen? It should change the way that we treat them. So my question for you today is, do we ask God daily to give us a different perspective on those people around us? Jesus tells us we've got to not seek revenge. We've got to remember our neighbor is also our enemy is also our neighbor. And finally, he tells us to remember that loving our enemy shows that we are different. Y'all say different. Verse 45 through 47, Jesus says, in that way you'll be acting as true children of your Father in heaven, for he gives sunlight to both the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust alike. That's a great verse, by the way, if you're talking to somebody and trying to explain the fallen and broken nature of our world, that God allows bad things to happen to good people. That's just the reality of our world. Verse 46, if you love only those who love you, what reward is there for that? Even corrupt tax collectors do that much. If you are only kind to your friends, Jesus says, how are you different from anyone else? Even pagans do that. You see, when we love our enemies, what happens is the world sees that and it looks different. because the rest of the world does not do that. When it comes to our enemies, the world says, fight back, and God says, forgive. The world says, get even, and God says, give grace. It's incredibly difficult to do, but we have to remember that God first did it for us. And because he did it for us, we should in turn do it for others also. And when we're able to have the courage to love our enemies, there is perhaps no brighter light that we could show to the world. John Krakauer said it this way: when you forgive, you love. And when you love, God's light shines upon you. Do we want God's light to shine upon us? I think most of us, if you're here today and you know Jesus, I would hope that your answer would be yes. And Jesus is saying one of the best ways to do that is to love people that are different than you. I'll close with this story. It's probably one that you are maybe somewhat familiar with. Several years ago, there was a story that broke out, I believe it happened in Dallas, about an off-duty police officer named Amber Geiger that walked into what she thought was her apartment. It was actually not her apartment, but in her mind, she thought it was her apartment, and she ended up seeing a man named Botham Jean who was in his own apartment, but she walked in thinking it was her own apartment and perceived him as an intruder in her own apartment. And she proceeded, just as a natural act of panic and defense, proceeded to shoot him and ended up killing him. And later on, she was convicted in a trial of murder. And if you are familiar with this story, you may have seen Botham's brother Brant when Amber Geiger was sentenced. And Brant proceeded to share perhaps one of the most powerful 2-minute testimonies that I've ever seen in my life. And I want you to check out these 2 minutes as we end our time together today.
I can speak for myself. I forgive you. And I know if you go to God and ask him, he will forgive you. And I don't think anyone could say it. Again, I'm speaking for myself, not even bad for my family. But I love you just like anyone else. And I'm not gonna say I hope you rot and die just like my brother did, but I personally want the best for you. And I wasn't gonna ever say this in front of my family or anyone, but I don't even want you to go to jail. I want the best for you. Because I know that's exactly what both of them would want you to do. And the best would be give your life to Christ. I'm not gonna say anything else. I think giving your life to Christ would be the best thing that both of them would want you to do. Again, I love you as a person. And I don't wish anything bad on you. I don't know if this is possible, but can I give her a hug, please? Please?
Yes.
Every time I watch that, I'm okay until the very end. What a powerful, powerful picture of the love and forgiveness and mercy of Jesus at work. The only way he could do that is through a radical relationship with Jesus. And the radical love of Jesus, church, it changes the world. It changes the world. My challenge for us today is I pray that we never have to go through something as difficult as Brant went through. But when we go through difficulty, when we encounter enemies, can we show that kind of love to the world around us? Because if we do, God will use us to change the world. We hope the message you just watched encourages your faith and helps you to follow Jesus more closely. And if you've never given your life to Jesus, we want to share with you how you can do that. If you text the word DECIDE to the number that's going to be on your screen, someone from our team is going to follow up with you and help answer any questions you might have about following Jesus. Also want you to know, thank you so much for your support of our church, both for our church family and our extended family. The only way we can bring messages like the one you just watched is through your generosity. If you would like to support the work that God is doing through our ministry, you can go to sunsetcanyonchurch.org and click on the button that says Give. We hope you have a great week, and we pray that God continues to work in your life in the days to come.